You know that moment when you discover your husband's real estate investment was actually a down payment on his girlfriend's love nest? Yeah, me neither. Until last Tuesday when I found the mortgage papers tucked inside his business portfolio. I'm Astrid, 45 years old, owner of 3 successful boutiques in Greenwich, Connecticut, and apparently the proud wife of a man who thinks our $500,000 home is just my temporary housing arrangement. The whole delightful revelation started when Jasper stormed into our kitchen Tuesday morning, coffee still brewing, and announced with the dramatic flair of a soap opera villain, "Your time is up here, Astrid. I'm moving in with the other woman in this house." Not exactly the breakfast conversation I was expecting, but then again, 18 years of marriage to this man has taught me to expect the unexpected. What he didn't expect was my reaction, or rather, my complete lack of one. While he stood there, chest puffed out like a peacock in mid-display, waiting for tears, pleading, or at least some good old-fashioned female hysteria, I simply finished stirring my coffee and asked if he wanted his usual 2 sugars or if his new lifestyle required artificial sweeteners. The look of confusion on his face was absolutely priceless. Apparently, his dramatic exit speech hadn't accounted for a wife who treats life-altering announcements like weather reports. You see, what dear Jasper failed to realize is that running 3 successful boutiques in Connecticut's most affluent area requires a certain level of, let's call it, business acumen. The same skills that help me track inventory, manage cash flow, and negotiate with suppliers also come in handy when your husband starts making mysterious investment meetings that coincidentally align with his yoga instructor's schedule. Brooklyn, 28 years old, perky as a cheerleader, and apparently flexible in more ways than her yoga certification suggests. I'd been tracking his business expenses for months. Those weekend trips to scout new properties in the Hamptons? Funny how they always coincided with Brooklyn's Instagram posts from the exact same locations. The consultation fees he was paying to his business partner? Apparently, consulting on lingerie preferences requires a significant monthly retainer. And those late-night strategy sessions discussing market opportunities? Well, I suppose there's a market for everything. But here's where Tuesday morning got really interesting. After delivering his ultimatum with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer, Jasper expected me to pack my bags and slink away like some wounded animal. Instead, I calmly reached into my purse, pulled out the house keys, and placed them on our Italian marble countertop with the gentle precision of a chess master making her final move. "Take care of the property taxes, darling," I said, gathering my Louis Vuitton bag, the one he'd bought me for our 15th anniversary, back when he still remembered I existed. "They're due next month." The confusion in his eyes was almost adorable. Almost. What Jasper didn't know, what he couldn't have possibly known because he'd been too busy consulting on his girlfriend's flexibility training, was that I'd spent the last 3 months doing my own kind of real estate research. While he was playing house with Brooklyn, I was playing a much more sophisticated game with our actual house. You see, 18 years ago, when we bought this place, young and stupidly in love, we'd structured the ownership through a joint LLC for tax purposes. Standard practice, really. Except Jasper had always left the boring paperwork stuff to me. He was the big picture guy, the visionary, the one who made grand gestures and dramatic announcements. I was just the detail-oriented wife who handled the tedious business of keeping our life running smoothly. Those tedious details, as it turns out, included being the managing member of our property LLC, which meant that while Jasper was busy making plans to install his 28-year-old girlfriend in our home, he'd forgotten one tiny detail. He couldn't actually kick me out of a house I legally controlled. But why spoil his surprise with boring legal facts when I could let him figure it out the fun way? I spent Tuesday afternoon at my flagship boutique in downtown Greenwich, helping customers and pretending this was just another ordinary day. Meanwhile, Jasper was presumably explaining to Brooklyn that their romantic nest was finally available for full-time occupancy. I could only imagine their celebration, perhaps some champagne, maybe a few selfies in what she thought was about to become their master bedroom. Definitely some planning about redecorating to suit her aesthetic preferences. What I was actually doing, between helping Mrs. Peterson find the perfect scarf and processing inventory for our fall collection, was making a few strategic phone calls to my attorney and my accountant. Amazing how quickly legal paperwork can be processed when you've been preparing for months and have all your documentation in perfect order. By Wednesday evening, Brooklyn had moved her belongings into my house. Her Instagram stories showed her unpacking boxes in our bedroom, arranging her essential oils on my vanity, and posing with Jasper in what she captioned as our forever home. The comments from her followers were exactly what you'd expect. Lots of heart-eye emojis and congratulations on her beautiful new place. Thursday morning, I drove past the house, my house, and saw Brooklyn's little Honda Civic parked in the driveway next to Jasper's BMW. She'd even put up new curtains in the living room windows. Cute. Very domestic. Very temporary. I spent Thursday quietly transferring the remaining assets from our joint accounts to my business accounts. Perfectly legal, considering they were funds I'd contributed from my boutique profits anyway. Jasper had always been generous about letting me handle our finances, which meant he had absolutely no idea how much money we actually had or where it came from. His contribution was his real estate developer salary. Mine was the steady income from 3 thriving businesses, plus the investment portfolio I'd been building for years. Friday morning brought the first phone call, Jasper sounding confused and slightly panicked, asking why his credit cards weren't working at the gas station. I explained in my sweetest voice that I'd simply consolidated our finances to avoid any confusion during his transition period. Wasn't I thoughtful? I even offered to send him a detailed spreadsheet showing exactly which accounts had been moved and why. The second phone call came Friday afternoon. This time, he was less confused and significantly more agitated, demanding to know why the electricity had been shut off at the house. I gently reminded him that utility bills, like property taxes, were now his responsibility as the primary occupant. After all, he'd made it quite clear that I no longer lived there. Brooklyn's Instagram stories from Friday evening showed her and Jasper eating takeout by candlelight, which she'd romantically captioned as camping in our new home. The poor girl had no idea she was about to experience a very different kind of adventure than she'd bargained for. Saturday morning brought what I like to call the Great Awakening, though not the spiritual kind Brooklyn was probably expecting from her yoga background. The phone started ringing at 7:30 a.m., and judging by Jasper's increasingly frantic tone, their romantic camping adventure had taken a decidedly unromantic turn. Astrid, what the hell is going on? There's a notice on the door about property taxes and some kind of lien. His voice had that wonderful pitch that happens when reality starts crashing into carefully constructed fantasies. I was sipping my perfectly brewed coffee from my temporary apartment downtown, a lovely 2-bedroom place I'd leased months ago under my business name, complete with a view of the harbor. Oh, that, I said, examining my manicure with the casual interest of someone discussing the weather. I mentioned the property taxes were due, remember? Tuesday morning, right after your touching speech about my time being up. The silence on the other end was absolutely delicious. You could practically hear his brain trying to process information it had never bothered to learn. What Jasper discovered that Saturday, and what Brooklyn learned through a very educational crash course in real estate law, was that property taxes in Greenwich are substantial. When you own a $500,000 home in one of Connecticut's wealthiest towns, the annual tax bill tends to reflect that luxury. And when you've been letting your detail-oriented wife handle all those boring financial matters for 18 years, you might not realize exactly how substantial those taxes actually are. But here's where it gets really interesting. Remember those business investments Jasper had been making? Those weekend trips to the Hamptons? The consulting fees? The mysterious expenses that I'd been so carefully documenting? Well, it turns out that when you're spending money on your girlfriend's lifestyle while your wife handles the actual household expenses, you might not notice that those household expenses have been getting paid from a different source. For the past 6 months, while Jasper was busy investing in Brooklyn's happiness, I'd been quietly allowing our joint account, the one he monitored, the one he thought was handling our mortgage and property taxes, to maintain just enough balance to avoid triggering any overdraft notices. The actual bills? Those were being paid from my business accounts, which gave me complete documentation of exactly how much Jasper's midlife crisis was costing our household. Brooklyn's Instagram posts from Saturday showed a significant shift in tone. Gone were the romantic candlelit dinners and forever home captions. Instead, she posted a story featuring their breakfast of gas station coffee and convenience store pastries, with the notably less enthusiastic caption, "Roughing it while we sort out some paperwork." Sunday brought the next wave of educational opportunities. Jasper called at 6 a.m., which suggested he'd been up all night researching property law. "You can't just abandon the house and leave us responsible for everything," he shouted into the phone. "We had an agreement." "We did indeed," I agreed pleasantly. "You said my time was up here, and I respected your decision. I left the keys just as you requested." What I didn't mention was that leaving the keys didn't actually transfer legal responsibility. But why spoil his learning experience with premature explanations? The agreement he was referring to, of course, was the one he'd made in his head where I would meekly accept his ultimatum, quietly disappear, and somehow continue paying all the bills for a house I was no longer allowed to live in. It's fascinating how men who pride themselves on being business savvy can completely miss the logical flaws in their own plans. Monday morning brought my favorite phone call of the week. This time, it was Brooklyn, her perky yoga instructor voice noticeably strained. "Astrid? Hi, this is Brooklyn. Could we maybe talk? Like, woman to woman?" Oh, this was going to be good. We met at Starbucks, neutral territory, and frankly, I needed the entertainment. Brooklyn showed up looking significantly less Instagram-ready than usual. Dark circles under her eyes, hair in a messy bun that wasn't the intentionally messy kind, and wearing the same outfit I'd seen in her posts from the day before. "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding," she began, stirring her venti caramel macchiato with the nervous energy of someone who'd recently discovered that playing house with married men involves more than just redecorating and couples yoga. "Oh, I don't think so," I replied, savoring my simple black coffee. Jasper was very clear on Tuesday. His exact words were, "Your time is up here." I thought it was quite direct, actually. The poor girl looked like she was about to cry, which was almost enough to make me feel sorry for her. Almost. Brooklyn explained that they'd spent the weekend trying to figure out how to pay the property taxes, the utility deposits, and the various other expenses that come with maintaining a $500,000 home. Jasper's real estate developer salary, while decent, wasn't structured for handling sudden large expenses, especially when he'd been spending his discretionary income on his girlfriend's lifestyle for months. "The thing is," Brooklyn said, leaning forward conspiratorially, "Jasper says you've always handled the money stuff, so maybe you could just help us transition? Like, maybe pay this one last time and then we'll take over?" The audacity was breathtaking. She wanted me to pay the bills so she could live in my house with my husband. I had to admire her optimism, even if her logic needed some work. "That's an interesting proposal," I said thoughtfully. "But I'm afraid I'm experiencing some cash flow issues of my own. You see, I recently had to lease a new apartment, and starting over at 45 is surprisingly expensive." What I didn't mention was that my cash flow issues were entirely voluntary and extremely temporary. Brooklyn's face fell as she realized that her plan A, convince the discarded wife to subsidize the new girlfriend's lifestyle, wasn't going to work. "But what are we supposed to do? Jasper says the house will go into foreclosure if we can't pay the taxes, and I just moved all my stuff in. Have you considered downsizing?" I suggested helpfully. "There are some lovely rental properties in the area, much more manageable for a young couple starting out." Brooklyn's expression suggested she was beginning to understand that her fairy tale ending might need some serious editing. Tuesday, exactly 1 week after Jasper's dramatic announcement, brought the phone call I'd been expecting. This time, his voice had moved beyond frustration into genuine panic. Tuesday's phone call was pure poetry. Jasper's voice had reached that particular octave that happens when reality starts dismantling carefully constructed delusions piece by piece. "Astrid, we need to talk. Seriously, Brooklyn found some papers in the house and we're confused about a few things." "Oh, the LLC documents?" I asked innocently, as if I hadn't been waiting for this exact conversation. "Yes, those boring legal papers I've been managing all these years. What seems to be confusing you?" I was sitting in my downtown apartment, organizing the receipts from Jasper's 18-month affair. Every romantic dinner, every weekend getaway, every piece of jewelry that wasn't for me. Amazing how much documentation accumulates when you're methodical about record keeping. What Brooklyn had discovered, tucked away in our home office, the room Jasper never entered because paperwork gives him headaches, was the complete file on our property ownership structure. Turns out that when your wife handles all the boring business stuff for nearly 2 decades, she tends to understand exactly how everything works, including the rather important detail that our house wasn't owned by Jasper and Astrid as individuals, but by Greenwich Properties LLC, with yours truly as the managing member. You can't just... we live here now, Jasper sputtered. Brooklyn moved her stuff in. We're making this work. And I'm so happy for you both, I said warmly. It's wonderful that you found love. However, as the managing member of the LLC that owns the property, I do have certain fiduciary responsibilities regarding unauthorized occupancy and liability issues. God, I loved using business terminology on him. It was like watching someone try to solve calculus with finger counting. The beautiful thing about LLCs is that they're designed to protect assets and limit liability. When Jasper decided to move his girlfriend into our property without consulting the managing member, he'd essentially created a situation where the LLC could be held liable for any damages, accidents, or legal issues involving an unauthorized occupant. From a business perspective, I had an obligation to protect the company's interests. Brooklyn got on the phone next, her yoga instructor serenity completely abandoned. But I signed a lease. Jasper showed me a rental agreement. Oh, this was getting better by the minute. That's fascinating, I said, genuinely curious now. Could you email me a copy of that lease? I'd love to see what terms Jasper offered. What I suspected, and what Brooklyn confirmed when she sent the document an hour later, was that Jasper had drafted a rental agreement for property he didn't actually have the authority to rent. The lease was a masterpiece of wishful thinking. Jasper had listed himself as property owner and offered Brooklyn a monthly rent that was roughly half of what our property taxes alone cost per month. He'd also included amenities like pool maintenance and landscaping services that I'd been coordinating and paying for through our household management company for years. But here's where Jasper's business acumen really shone. He'd structured Brooklyn's lease to begin the day after he kicked me out, with her first month's rent due on the 15th of the month, which meant that not only was he illegally subletting property he didn't control, but he was also planning to use Brooklyn's rent money to pay expenses that were already a month behind. Wednesday brought a visit from my attorney, Margaret Pierce, a shark in Armani who'd been handling my business legal matters for years. We met at my boutique after hours, spreading documents across my office like generals planning a campaign. This is actually more straightforward than I expected, Margaret said, reviewing the LLC paperwork and Jasper's improvised rental agreement. He's essentially squatting in property owned by your LLC and attempting to sublease it without authorization. From a legal standpoint, you have grounds for immediate eviction proceedings. How immediate are we talking? I asked, though I was already pretty sure I knew the answer. Connecticut law allows for expedited eviction in cases of unauthorized occupancy, especially when there's evidence of attempted fraud, which this rental agreement definitely qualifies as. We could have them out within 2 weeks, maybe sooner if we can demonstrate financial damages to the LLC. The financial damages were easy to document. I'd been tracking every expense related to Jasper's affair for months, and the numbers were impressive. The weekend getaways alone totaled more than our annual property taxes. Add in the restaurant bills, jewelry purchases, and Brooklyn's various gifts, and we were looking at a substantial sum that had been diverted from our household finances. But simple eviction seemed almost too easy. After 18 years of marriage, after watching Jasper dismiss my contributions while funding his girlfriend's lifestyle, after being told my time was up in my own home, I felt like the situation called for something more educational. What if we approached this differently? I asked Margaret. What if instead of evicting them, we treated this like the business transaction Jasper seems to think it is? Margaret's smile was absolutely predatory. I'm listening. Here's what most people don't understand about LLCs. They can buy and sell assets, including debt. Over the past few months, while Jasper was busy playing house, I'd been quietly purchasing some of his outstanding obligations. That expensive BMW he drove, the one he'd been making payments on for 3 years, I now owned the loan, having bought it from the original lender at a slight discount through my LLC. The country club membership he was so proud of, the one where he'd been taking Brooklyn for those romantic brunches. I'd recently acquired the outstanding balance on that account as well. Amazing how willing creditors are to sell debt when you approach them professionally with cash offers. But my favorite acquisition was the mortgage on the small condo Brooklyn had been renting before moving in with Jasper. She'd been struggling with payments. Yoga instruction apparently doesn't pay as well as one might hope, and had accumulated several months of arrears. When her landlord mentioned he was considering selling the property to recover his losses, I'd made him an offer that was difficult to refuse. "So let me understand this correctly," Margaret said, reviewing my documentation. "You now own Jasper's car loan, his club membership debt, and his girlfriend's former rental obligation? I prefer to think of it as diversifying the LLC's investment portfolio," I said. Jasper always said I should be more aggressive with our business ventures. Thursday morning, I called Jasper with a proposition. "I've been thinking about our situation, and I believe I have a solution that could work for everyone involved." Thursday morning's phone call was the culmination of months of careful planning. I could practically hear Jasper's relief when I began with, "I've been thinking about our situation, and I believe I have a solution that could work for everyone." Poor man had no idea that my definition of everyone had some very specific limitations. "Thank God," he breathed into the phone. "Brooklyn's been crying for 2 days, and I just want to figure this out reasonably." Reasonably. After 18 years of marriage, after being told my time was up in my own home, after watching him spend our money on another woman's happiness, now he wanted to be reasonable. "I'm prepared to offer you both a legal pathway to remain in the house," I said, settling into my desk chair at the boutique with the satisfaction of someone about to deliver a perfectly crafted business proposal. "However, as the managing member of the LLC that owns the property, I do need to address some liability issues first." The first liability issue, I explained, was the unauthorized occupancy situation. Brooklyn was living in property owned by my LLC without proper lease agreements or insurance coverage. From a business perspective, this created significant exposure for the company. However, I was prepared to legitimize the arrangement through a formal rental contract. "That sounds perfect," Jasper said, and I could hear Brooklyn in the background asking what was happening. "What kind of rent are we talking about?" "Market rate for a $500,000 property in Greenwich," I replied cheerfully. "I've had it appraised recently, and comparable rentals in the area are running about $4,000 per month, plus utilities and maintenance fees." The silence on the other end was gratifying. "4,000?" Jasper's voice had returned to that higher pitch. "That's more than our mortgage payment was." "Was," I agreed. "But you're not dealing with a mortgage anymore. You're dealing with a rental property owned by an LLC that needs to generate appropriate returns for its stakeholders." What I didn't mention was that I'd had the property reappraised specifically for rental purposes, and $4,000 was actually on the conservative end of the market range. But here's where the conversation got really interesting. The second liability issue involved outstanding debts that could potentially attach to LLC assets. As the managing member, I had a fiduciary responsibility to protect company property from creditor claims, which brought us to some unfortunate discoveries I'd made regarding Jasper's financial obligations. "I'm afraid there are some outstanding items that need to be resolved before we can finalize any rental arrangements," I continued, opening the folder Margaret had prepared. "It seems your BMW loan has gone into arrears. 3 months behind, according to my information." "What? That's impossible. I've been making the payments automatically from our joint account." Oh, this was the moment I'd been waiting for. "From our former joint account," I corrected gently. "The one I closed last week when I consolidated our finances to avoid confusion during your transition. I assumed you'd want to handle your own expenses now that you're establishing an independent household. The beautiful thing about automatic payments is that when the account they're drawn from no longer exists, the payments stop happening. And when payments stop happening on secured debt like car loans, creditors tend to get aggressive quite quickly. especially when they discover that the borrower's wife has been controlling the payment account and is no longer legally obligated to maintain it. Brooklyn got on the phone, her voice tight with stress. Astrid, we can work this out, right? Like, maybe we could do payments or something? Jasper says you're really good with money, so maybe you could help us figure out a plan. Actually, Brooklyn, I might be able to help with that, I said, pulling out my second folder. I've recently expanded my investment portfolio to include some debt acquisition opportunities. Interestingly enough, I've acquired several obligations that might be relevant to your situation. What I'd acquired, through my LLC and with Margaret's guidance, was essentially the power to determine how aggressive the collection efforts on Jasper's debts would be. When you own someone's debt, you get to decide payment terms, grace periods, and enforcement actions. It's amazing how much leverage you can accumulate when you approach financial planning strategically. The BMW loan was the easiest example to explain. I now owned Jasper's car debt, which meant I could offer him new payment terms directly. Those terms, coincidentally, happened to align perfectly with the rental rate I was proposing for the house. He could either pay me $4,000 per month for the privilege of living in my property, or I could repossess his car and evict them both. His choice, really. You bought my car loan. Jasper's voice had moved beyond panic into something approaching disbelief. How is that even legal? Debt acquisition is a standard investment practice, I explained patiently. LLCs purchase distressed assets all the time. When creditors want to recover funds quickly, they'll often sell loans at a discount to investors who can collect more efficiently. What I didn't mention was how much I'd enjoyed the process of becoming his creditor. But the car loan was just the appetizer. The main course involved Brooklyn's former rental property, the cute little condo she'd been renting before moving in with my husband. The property owner had been struggling with her payment arrears and was facing foreclosure himself. When I'd approached him about purchasing the building, he'd been almost pathetically grateful. Brooklyn, sweetheart, I hope you maintained renter's insurance on your old place, I said, consulting my notes. Because technically you're still legally responsible for the remaining lease term. 8 more months, according to my records, at $1,500 per month. The sound Brooklyn made wasn't quite a gasp and wasn't quite a sob. It was the sound someone makes when they realize that their fairy tale romance is about to cost them $12,000 in obligations they'd forgotten about. But I moved out, she protested. Jasper said I didn't need to worry about that lease anymore. Jasper isn't a party to your rental agreement, I pointed out reasonably. And unfortunately, when you abandoned the property without proper notice, you remained liable for the full lease term. The previous owner was preparing to pursue collection, but when I purchased the building, I inherited that obligation along with the asset. What I was offering them was actually quite generous, from a certain perspective. Instead of pursuing separate collection actions on Jasper's car debt and Brooklyn's rental arrears, I was willing to consolidate everything into one simple arrangement. They could remain in the house, my house, for $4,000 per month, and I would consider their other debt satisfied as part of the rental agreement. This is insane, Jasper said, but his voice had lost its fight. You're basically blackmailing us into paying twice what the house is worth. I'm offering you a business solution to a complex financial situation, I corrected. You're welcome to explore other options, of course. I'm sure there are lovely rental properties available in your price range, though you might want to resolve the car situation first. It's difficult to apartment hunt without transportation. Friday morning brought their decision, delivered by Brooklyn in a voice that sounded like she'd been crying for hours. Friday morning's call came at exactly 8 a.m., Brooklyn's voice carrying the particular exhaustion that comes from spending all night realizing your romantic fairy tale was actually a financial nightmare. Astrid? We accept your terms. The $4,000 per month. All of it. Wonderful, I said, genuinely pleased. Margaret will have the rental agreements ready by Monday. You'll need first month's rent plus security deposit up front, of course. Standard business practice. What I didn't mention was that the security deposit for a property with a history of unauthorized occupancy was necessarily substantial. Another month's rent, plus damages coverage. The beautiful irony wasn't lost on me. Jasper had kicked me out of my own house so he could play house with his girlfriend, and now they were paying me $8,000 just to move in, plus $4,000 every month thereafter to stay. In essence, I'd turned my cheating husband into my tenant and his mistress into a co-signer on a lease that cost more than most people's salaries. But the real satisfaction came from watching the long-term mathematics play out. At $4,000 per month, they'd be paying me $48,000 per year to live in a house that had been costing me roughly $24,000 annually in mortgage, taxes, and maintenance. Within 2 years, their rent would cover the entire remaining mortgage balance. After that, it would be pure profit from property I already owned. Brooklyn's Instagram posts from that weekend told a story more compelling than any revenge novel. Gone were the triumphant forever home captions and romantic couple selfies. Instead, she posted pictures of their weekend activities, touring budget apartments, researching roommate situations, and what appeared to be a very tense conversation at a financial planning office. Sunday evening brought my favorite post of all, a photo of moving boxes with the caption, "Sometimes the universe has different plans than we do. Grateful for the lessons." The comments were exactly what you'd expect. Friends asking what happened, offering spare bedrooms, and generally trying to piece together why her dream home situation had lasted exactly 2 weeks. Monday morning, they signed the lease agreement in Margaret's office. Jasper looked like a man who'd aged 5 years in 2 weeks, signing documents that legally required him to pay his ex-wife's LLC more money than he'd ever voluntarily spent on their marriage. Brooklyn kept staring at the numbers like she was hoping they might change through sheer force of will. "Just to clarify the terms," Margaret said, reviewing each page with professional thoroughness. "Rent is due on the 1st of each month, with a 10-day grace period. After that, late fees apply at 5% of the monthly rent per day. Failure to pay within 30 days constitutes grounds for immediate eviction. $200 per day in late fees." It was almost enough to make me hope they'd miss a payment, just so I could watch Jasper calculate exactly how expensive his romantic gesture had become. But here's what I found most satisfying about the entire arrangement. I hadn't destroyed their relationship. I'd simply made it cost what it was actually worth. For 18 months, Jasper had been funding their romance with money that belonged to our marriage, our household, our future. Now they could fund it themselves, at market rates, with complete transparency about the actual expense. The money I'd lost in the divorce settlement, if you could call it that when no actual divorce had occurred, turned out to be the best investment I'd never made. My boutiques were thriving without the distraction of managing a husband's midlife crisis. My new apartment was peaceful in ways my marriage had never been. And my rental property was generating income that exceeded my most optimistic business projections. 6 months later, I received a wedding invitation. Jasper and Brooklyn had decided to make their arrangement official, which was actually quite romantic if you overlooked the part where their wedding venue was property owned by the bride's husband's ex-wife. The invitation was addressed to Ms. Astrid Hamilton, Greenwich Properties, LLC. Apparently, they'd finally learned to spell my business name correctly. I didn't attend the wedding, though I did send a congratulatory gift. A beautiful crystal vase with a card that read, "Wishing you both the happiness you can afford." Margaret thought it was excessive, but I felt like the sentiment captured the spirit of our new relationship perfectly. The rental checks arrive promptly on the 1st of every month, deposited automatically into my LLC account. Sometimes I wonder if Jasper thinks about the irony when he writes them, paying rent to live in what used to be his own home, to a landlord who used to be his wife, for the privilege of being with a woman who cost him everything he'd built over 18 years of marriage. But mostly, I don't think about them at all. I'm too busy expanding my boutique chain, planning my next real estate acquisition, and enjoying the particular peace that comes from discovering you're much stronger than anyone, including yourself, ever imagined. And if you're wondering what happened to Brooklyn's yoga instructor career, well, let's just say it's difficult to maintain professional credibility when your personal life becomes the subject of Greenwich gossip circles. She's transitioned into retail management now, working at a lovely little store in the strip mall. I believe she's quite good with customer service, though I hear she's still learning to balance the register. The property taxes are due next month. I'm sure they'll handle it just fine.